Well, that was an incredible introduction, so I don't know if I can live up to that, but thank you. I am Sally, and I am indeed going to be talking about the future today. And I love how we've already seen kind of a version of this already, so already we are evolving. I just want to go back here. I don't have, not quite set up quite well. Technical. Here we go. No, apologies. This is what happens when tech checks don't go quite right. OK. Much better. Right, so the web has been evolving an awful lot since its inception, and I think that where we're at today is pretty cool. So we've seen some really good stuff from the speakers that have come before me. But I just want to tell you, in 5 years' time, things are going to be absolutely amazing. So let's have a little sneak peek of what the internet of 2021 is going to be like.
Password enter. Welcome to BRT Online. Global net selected. What are you doing?
Making a long-distance phone call. Beijing Hotel.
Beijing selected. Access denied. Access granted. Hotel Beijing selected.
Now, I'm really sorry, I've got to stop it there. We've got some time. If you do want to watch more, that is a clip from the 1995 film Johnny Mnemonic, which is based incredibly loosely on a short story by William Gibson. And I love that not only because it's just absolutely terrible, but it's a great example of the challenges that we face when we try and work with the future, whilst also being firmly grounded and constrained by the realities of our present. And the film's pretty well known, and unsurprisingly, with most things like that, you can find it nowadays online in a lot of different places. And for once, one of the best things is actually the YouTube comments. So you can see things like this. And it's really interesting because many of the commenters' focus is actually on the hardware, which is perhaps because we're all so used to the kind of flat, clean, medium-S designs that the terrifying visual aesthetic and hand-waving nonsense just gets thrown out completely. But the film actually uses hardware concepts that did exist at the time. So Johnny's visor that he's wearing is actually called an iPhone, which gets quoted quite a lot. And for the video game nerds amongst you, you might know that the data gloves that he's used were actually the much maligned Nintendo Power Gloves. So that was an actual product. But there are things within that we actually maybe take for granted or kind of just gloss over. So right at the end there, there's a very quick sort of blink if you miss it piece of live translation feature, which obviously was just mere fancy at the time. So we've got this very forward-thinking stylization, which gets balanced with the limitations that nobody at that point thought that we could ever get round. So dial-up, as that person there mentions. And this is a trend that we really see again and again with technology predictions. And it's in everything from sci-fi through to this, which is a piece of German chocolate box art, which they did a series of, and it basically was intended to predict what the year 2000 might be like. And as you can see, they can predict us walking on water, but only through the means that they could comprehend at the time. So we've got these air balloons, and the weird little shoe things, the sort of canoe shoes that they're wearing, which is very strange. But that's very much the challenge. So how do we work with the future whilst being constrained by the realities of our present? And more to the point, why do we actually want to work with the future? Well, to answer that, we first need to understand the challenges that the future can bring us and our clients, both in the immediacy and the near future and beyond. So this is a white elephant, And white elephants were very often kept by Southeast Asian monarchs as status symbols. And they were considered sacred, and to own one was a massive, it's a really big deal. And if you'd done something particularly special, a monarch might actually gift you a white elephant. But I'm sure, I don't know about you, I've personally got nowhere to put an elephant or feed it. Quite difficult on the upkeep. Because they're sacred as well, they're protected from work, so you can't even put it out there and make it do something useful. And you can't just get rid of it because the monarch's given it to you, and you can't just, hide it in a drawer somewhere. So you end up with this really expensive thing that isn't actually much practical use and that you can't really get rid of. In the West, we've started to use the term to refer to expensive burdens that fail to meet expectations. And as Phil sort of talked about a little bit, we don't want things to become redundant. We don't want our websites to end up as expensive white elephants that aren't much use, but which we can't really get rid of. So the problem is, what we plan now may not necessarily be relevant in the future for whatever reason. Our early conversations that we have with clients are really focused on the benefits that we can bring, how well we understand their needs at this point in time, and what plans we have to create these solutions that match up with that. But that's as we understand them now. And we usually do build in some kind of awareness that things will change, hopefully. But the reality is that an awful lot can change. So not just are we considering our project timelines and how that might change in terms of, I'm sure we've all been there with people changing their minds, but we've also got the changing needs and expectations of our users. We've got the wider business itself. We've got technology trends, so how we make things, how people use things, what's available, what works and what doesn't. And then we've got what I like to call wildcards. So this is anything from alien landings through to a terrorist attack, which might wipe out the entire economy and our budget for the next 2 years we had planned. So these are things that we don't normally expect. And obviously thinking in a more agile way can start to help with that, and we can start to kind of build in more flexible practices. But there's a lot more that we can do when we actually start thinking about the future. This is a view that was shared by the Future Friendly movement, so I don't know if we've got any T-shirts in our audience. There's usually a couple floating around. And this was actually all put together in 2012, but this all still holds true today in the future from when they originally said it. And actually, that's the reality. Many of us do exist in the future daily, so we might anticipate new browser releases, new devices, we might check support using websites like this, and we might bookmark ever-changing specs. And of course, we're all here at a conference, and I'm sure that we're going to be hearing about lots of things that we can and we should be using already. Heard a little bit this morning. We hopefully know by now that we can't control who will use our websites or the capabilities of the devices they'll be using. So hopefully we are all thinking about responsive design and progressive enhancement. It feels obvious, but it's got to be said. Because these are actually the choices that we make. And as people who make websites, we need to make decisions about what we're using and why. And like the people of the past, we're balancing those realities of today with the unknowns of tomorrow in the future. Once we start making decisions, the danger then becomes that we need to be mindful, even if they're right for us now, they may not be right in every situation in the future. So my job is quite broad, as the intro said. I basically work as a solutions architect and a consultant, and I very often work a lot on transformation projects. And I spent 3 months last year with one of the UK's big energy companies. Basically, they were in a place where their internal systems were over 20 years old. And whilst they'd originally done a great job, nowadays they're really struggling to meet either the customer or the internal business needs. And as you can imagine with something like that, there's a massive amount of technical debt involved. It was really hard for them to get developers who could work with the technologies that were in play. And actually, because of all the mess that they had to deal with, any changes took 6 months to actually be rolled out, which I just found unbelievable. And so they'd try to do things like put sticky tape on and patch over with cosmetic stuff. But actually, when you start to look behind that, and I did some audits and things like that, you get all the usual things of numerous really extremely old versions of libraries being used. There's accessibility issues down to horribly messy implementations. And of course, you probably might have some huge performance issues too. Once you fall behind like this, it's actually really easy to let all of those limitations keep you down because you're being crushed by that white elephant. And you might start to feel like maybe you just need to get rid of the elephant, it might come across a horrible accident or something like that. Because all you're trying to do is to keep up, when really you want to be getting ahead. You want to be doing the cool stuff and beating all of your competitors. So my client had got into that dreaded cycle of how it's all broken. We have to throw it all out and start again, which in practice, in theory, sounds great. But actually, the reality is that can be absolutely terrifying for people to do because you are starting from nothing. And what you do when you get to this point is you start to forget about all the good things that your choices and your technologies have done over the year. And you just instead focus on how overwhelming your current situation is, which meant that in my role on the project, I had to basically make technology and development approach recommendations. And so I was tasked with picking solutions that would be able to meet needs for the next 5 to 10 years at least, because they didn't want to be back in that situation having to start again, which I'm sure you've probably all been in a place where you've felt a little bit like that. But of course, it's not just project problems. So a lot of the challenges around the future actually present themselves as problems for us as individuals as well. Because as people who make websites, not thinking about the future can actually lead us to maybe be the person responsible for or playing a part in those kind of issues. And it can also leave you really vulnerable to being blindsided by change or being maybe left behind and becoming a little bit undesirable as a professional. It's really easy, too, to feel overwhelmed, and I think the hipster syndrome that Phil was talking about has a little bit of a part in that. But you don't want to necessarily feel overwhelmed about everything that's here at the moment. There's a lot out there, let alone everything that is coming and could be coming or might be coming. The future's really hard. It's really hard. But luckily, due to the very nature of time itself, people have already been dealing with this for a very long time now. And one of the wonderful things about technology is that we experience it in the present, is that at some point it didn't exist, and it may only have been a concept in fantastic stories. So we could draw on this with our thinking for the future and to help us a little bit in our work. So many things like video calling and tablets and ebooks, they've been extremely frequently represented in sci-fi, and we have references dating back to the 50s. And these are all things that are hugely familiar to us, and again, we take for granted a little bit today. But at the time, they were mere fantasy. And there's other more futuristic concepts out there. So we've got things like this retrofuturism image, which thankfully wasn't predicting our fashion choices. But it comes with the caption, "Subways of the future will almost be noiseless or will make present subterranean transport systems seem snail slow. Pneumatically propelled gravity vacuum tube capsules will run underground at 240 miles per hour." When we compare visions like this with work being done by companies such as Tesla, it's really hard not to draw parallels. So this is a little bit of information around their Hyperloop project, which basically aims to solve mass transport for high-traffic city pairs, as they call them. So I think the example they give here is Los Angeles and San Francisco. And instead of 240 miles per hour, they're looking at more like 700. But just because we can dream it up, as their documentation actually details, if you look into it, the solutions aren't always forthcoming when we try and deal with reality. So the pneumatic vision from the previous slide would not actually be possible. They've looked into it, but there are some options around what might be. So it's kind of with hindsight and as we progress that we start to identify these limitations from things that we now know. But that doesn't mean that dreaming of the future is a pointless exercise. It's quite the opposite, in fact. Because stories can give really human context to technology. So how it's used, what problems it might have, and how people might react to it. And so the important thing here is to envisage the implications of its use, and therefore to help be better prepared for the future and for change. There's a whole school of thought called design fiction, which is basically a method of critical design that uses stories to raise questions about possible futures for design and the society. And so you can use the mentality to work through the benefits and the challenges and the implications of new designs, new technologies, and to imagine them in a human context rather than being purely engineering-led. So this is basically much of what we do as part of our UX work, but especially we need to keep an eye on the future. Because people project a lot onto the future, whether that's their hopes or their fears. And actually, it's much easier to find out about what people believe if you ask them about something that is a little bit fantastic and out there, rather than the present, because they often get too bogged down. So there's some really nice enablers for this. These are cards from the Design Fiction Product Work Kit by Near Future Laboratory. And as you can see, you're challenged to think with different scenarios in mind when you're actually planning something. And there's lots of different factors that you can start to explore. So when you tell the stories around it, when you play with ideas, you need to think about the social, the technological, environmental, economic, and political considerations in this context. And this kind of a game, using something physical like cards is extremely accessible to non-techies, non-web people. And it makes it great for things like workshops, because it allows people to think outside of the box and free themselves from those immediate kind of constraints and frustrations they have, and think about where things could go. But as we've seen with the Tesla example, what's really important is then bringing it back down to earth. So the idea of kind of atomic concepts and breaking things down into components is, again, really useful here, because you want to think about why your ideas, why your stories are successful. So what we want is really, amongst all that fiction and fantasy, to hone in on the really, really important elements of what makes this choice successful. And that also gets really interesting when you think not only at a project or a feature level, but also with your approaches too. So how differently could you actually do something, and how could that impact on the future of your work? And these are constraints cards, which you might have seen a few years back because they're on a Kickstarter. But they're really good fun for this. I'm sure there's some more controversial ones, depending on which side of the fences you sit on. But yeah, they're really, really nice conversations to have when you are thinking about how to plan your projects. But hey, it's not just technology. Everybody knows that the future is actually all about cool interfaces, right? Johnny showed us as much earlier. And there's been a really excellent study undertaken by a gentleman called Christopher Nuessel, and he's got a book called Make It So, and there's also a supporting website called SciFi Interfaces. And he's basically had the awful job of watching a lot of TV and films and everything else, and picking out every single interface within them, and analyzing it, and coming back to this point of finding that really useful thing within it that makes it something that we can actually learn from. So within the book, as you can see at the back here, they look at everything from mechanical controls to visual interfaces, gesture, communication methods, and so much more. But what they do at the end is they collect together a set of practical guidelines and opportunities that we can actually learn from and apply to our real projects. Because as they state in the conclusion, spoilers, we've seen repeatedly that if an interface works for an audience, there's something there that will work for users. Finding what that thing is and using it for inspiration in our own work is part of how we can use these speculative interfaces. And there's a story in the book that I really love, and it's that of the original Star Trek interfaces, which were these kind of things with lots of jewels, lots of buttons, and it was a very physical environment. And that obviously worked very well at the time. But when it came to kitting out the set for the next generation, they wanted not only something that looked very different and was very modern and futuristic, but they also had really tight budgets. So it's that classic thing of, client wanting everything and not having much money. And the way that they got around this was actually to create what we now know as the very famous LCARS interface, which is basically just a sheet of backlit acetate that was printed, so very, very cheap, but looked really cool, And you had all these people sat around just using touchscreens, which is one of the earliest kind of examples and really helped to popularize the concept. So actually, through our choices, we might end up helping to shape the future of technology itself. And if we think about responsive design, we kind of take this for granted, as we've talked about, but if people like John Alsop and Ethan Marcotte hadn't gone, hey guys, this makes sense, let's all talk about it and share some examples, then maybe we wouldn't have got here as fast, if at all. So by aiming to anticipate the future, we can hopefully do all of this much better. We can better support our users, we can create better, more sustainable things, and we can hopefully shape technologies themselves. But how do we do this? Well, a really important point here is what we actually mean by the future, because as I hope we all know from Back to the Future isn't just one time, because it's this constant spectrum, and it isn't also the same for all of us. Our 5-year future here in Poland might be very different from our 5-year future on the other side of the world, for instance. And as we've talked about with the timelines, variables can happen to create that spike off quite easily. It's also really important to think about what the future is in terms of the different elements of our projects as well. So within chemistry, you've got this concept of half-life, which is basically the time that it takes for half of that substance to decay. And in the context of the web, a shorter half-life is going to mean more regular assessment and updating, and a longer half-life, lifespan, they're the elements that play more into your kind of larger strategic thoughts. And when you choose your technologies, you should expect that they will start to decay as soon as they're in place. They're going to be updated or superseded, or needs are going to change. And so we start to think in terms of the different lifespans of our elements. And again, Phil was kind of touching on this a little bit in terms of you have all of these different environments, you've got the different components within them, and some of those are going to need to be swapped out. So typically, what we find is that elements of our projects that our users interact with directly are going to have a shorter lifespan than the technologies that power them. So when we think about working with the front end, we're often really on the forefront of a lot of change. And if you're tweaking your front-end code to support a new feature or something cool's come out that you want to put in, then great. But if you're swapping out your CRM after putting one in, a different one a week ago, then you've probably got some problems there. Where lifespans are expected to be longer, then the impact of change is typically felt a lot more. So expecting change at different rate is really key to architecting well. And not all of the elements of the project are obviously going to be under your direct control. So it might be that the accountancy system that underlies your project, for instance, is going to be something else, handled by somebody else. But minimizing the impact of change is usually very much a lot about kind of culture and attitudes and process. And you can help with this by championing the future in your work. You also want to be sure that making your front end, basically you want to make sure that your front end work is, as we've heard, really quite loosely coupled from other elements of the build as much as possible. There are other benefits and reasons to do this. But you primarily, when you think about the future, want to make sure that the half-lives don't start to impact on each other. So you don't want something's lifespan to start being dictated by another element. So you don't want your CMS, for instance, interfering too much with your markup and starting to impact on what you can do on the front end. When we think about the shorter lifespan of interfaces, things do move reasonably fast. And one of the interesting conversations that started to be had is the concept of zero UI, or no interface. And this is something that's kind of picking up quite a lot of speed at the moment. And Andy Goodman's done quite a lot of work here. So if we take a very simple example, we're going to be inputting a number into a form. So traditionally, this is going to expect direct text input, probably from a physical keyboard. But now, of course, we have virtual and touch keyboards. And for the most part, our inputs still stand. But we can probably make that a slightly nicer experience by using things like HTML5 input types. But then, of course, what about voice? Or perhaps we want the ability to perform character recognition by capturing an image directly and processing it. And maybe that's through a phone camera. Or maybe it's through the internet-enabled retinal implants that we're all going to have in a couple of years. Or maybe it's going to be even thoughts. So fundamentally, most of this stays the same. How we're storing the number stays the same. The function to capture and validate it stays exactly the same. But what's different is how we present that interaction to the user and how the capabilities that we can offer them may come and go. We need to be able to be flexible enough for these kind of enhancements. So this concept of the different levels of the future is particularly important because we need to think about our next sprint and the next month and next year and the next 10 years all at the same time because they are all the future of our work. So to wrap up, in the next few slides, I want to take you through how I see some of the points that I've raised today applying to our work. So this is a mix of what you're probably already doing and things that you might not be, that maybe we've talked about today that sparked something. So thinking about the future really does start with our discovery and planning. We've spoken about balancing the problems of now and the problems that may come up in the future, and how we can maybe use concepts like design thinking in workshops, and how we need to think about different strategies for change in Half-Lives. And we can make sure that throughout our projects, we can really champion the important principles and thinking about everything that we need to validate against by creating some project principles. So these are some that I created for a project last year, and these are going to be very specific to the individual challenges that you're facing, but they should act as a constant reminder of what you need to validate everything against. I also really like this quote, which is something to think about when we put together our requirements. So we don't want to try to predict technology, but we want to instead think about the future problems and user needs that might be there. And as with some of the design fiction cards, maybe think about the wider impacts too of our choices. Now when it comes to doing, so the designing and the building, Phil's talked about a lot of stuff that I think has some nice crossovers here. Because we want to think really modularly. We want to simplify, to separate our concerns, and to progressively enhance. Shortening the future does reduce the unknowns, but what we also want to do is to try to reduce too much of a connection to now and also think about what could be. Because if we only live with what we know now and don't ever consider where things may go, then we run the risk of never pushing our solutions and actually by having that unexpected change come along. Now, obviously, when we make something, we put it out there, we want to evolve. And the whole point of evolution is that everything up to that point, in terms of the mindset and the planning and building, it doesn't matter if you can't keep up with change. So we don't want to end up in the place where my client was, where we're sort of taking everything and then throwing it all out again. So we want to keep one eye on the future, but we want to think about what we can learn from the past as well. So make sure that you are aware of what those learnings could be and give yourself enough to go on. We want to also educate others about why education and the future are really important. How change does not mean failure. That's a really important point that a lot of people fail to recognize. We also want to play with new technologies, even if they're not maybe ready for production. So when you go to conferences and you hear about all the cool stuff that is out there, even if you don't think that you can put it into one of your projects, play with it anyway, because by getting the hang of these things early on, you can not only know when it's a good fit, when it's not, when it comes to your projects, but you might be able to talk about them, write about them, and just become better aware generally. So we are about to go into a coffee break, or a tea break, if you're me, and I drink a lot of Japanese teas. And I was actually at a conference last year where Andrew Pendrick gave a great talk about this really hard to translate Japanese phrase called wabi-sabi, which basically describes a mindset of accepting transience and imperfection and embracing the beauty that they can bring. So it's things like the fading autumn leaves, or it's the usage of a teacup over time, where you get the glaze wearing differently, and you might get these little cracks in the teacups. And it's also a mindset that I think is extremely relevant to our work with the internet, because by accepting change as a necessity in projects and not seeing it as failure or that we were maybe wrong with our choices, then we can start to identify the opportunities that change brings us instead. So don't just see these unknowns and imperfections of the future as something to be battled against, but actually something that can really push our work forwards. As my wise friend John says, Don't plan for the future, because there is no future. Just now and a series of next nows. So if you try to embrace the fluidity of the future, hopefully your projects will be a little bit better for it. Thank you very much.